Racist police tried to trap me, force me to confess. But they didn't know I was live streaming. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, the kind of day that made everything feel easy and calm. The protagonist had just finished a long day at work and was walking down the street, heading home. The street was quiet, with only a few people around, some walking their dogs, others heading into nearby stores. It was supposed to be a peaceful day. Suddenly, without warning, a police car pulled up beside them. The sound of tires screeching slightly against the pavement made the protagonist's heart race a little faster. They didn't think much of it at first. Maybe the officers were just making a routine stop or patrolling the area, but something felt off, like a quiet tension in the air. The officer in the driver's seat rolled down the window and asked the protagonist to stop. "Can I ask you a few questions?" the officer said. It was a typical question, one that seemed harmless enough. But the way the officer said it, with a stern tone and a sharp look, made the protagonist pause. There was something about the officer's eyes, something that made the air feel colder all of a sudden. The protagonist, unsure of what was happening, nodded and slowed their pace. "Sure," they replied, trying to keep their voice steady. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, they just stared at the protagonist, almost like they were trying to find something that wasn't there. "Where are you coming from?" the officer asked, narrowing their eyes. The question seemed simple enough, but there was a strange edge to it. The protagonist hesitated for a moment, then answered, "I just finished work. I'm heading home." The officer didn't seem satisfied with the answer. "And what are you doing in this area?" they asked, as if questioning every part of the protagonist's life. The question felt out of place, unnecessary. The protagonist couldn't help but feel a flicker of discomfort in their chest. They didn't understand why the officer was questioning them so intensely. Something didn't feel right, but they stayed calm, answering politely. "I'm just walking home. I live nearby," the protagonist said, their voice still calm but tinged with confusion. The officer continued to stare. Then the other officer, sitting in the passenger seat, leaned out of the window and spoke up. "You don't look like you're from around here," they said, their voice sharp. It was a strange thing to say. The protagonist was taken aback. They had lived in this neighborhood for years, and yet these officers were making assumptions based solely on their appearance. "Excuse me?" the protagonist asked, trying to keep the conversation neutral, but the frustration was starting to build. "Where are you really from?" the officer asked again, now leaning farther out of the car, their eyes scanning the protagonist from head to toe. The question felt like a racial comment disguised as curiosity. The officer's tone was accusing, and the protagonist felt the sting of it. They had been asked that question countless times before, but something about it now felt more loaded, more invasive. "I'm from here," the protagonist answered firmly, standing tall and trying to keep their composure. But the officer didn't seem satisfied. "You don't look like you're from here," the officer repeated, now sounding more hostile. "You don't belong here." The words hit hard. It wasn't just about where they lived. It was about being told, in no uncertain terms, that they didn't belong. It was a familiar feeling, one that the protagonist had encountered far too often in their life, but it still stung every time. They could feel their heart pounding, the adrenaline starting to build in their veins. The officer continued with their questions, each one more personal, more intrusive. It felt like they were trying to dig into their life, searching for something to pin on them. The questions didn't make sense. The officer asked about their family, about their background, about their life in this neighborhood. None of it seemed relevant to the situation, and the protagonist began to feel like they were being targeted, singled out for no reason other than their appearance. By now, the protagonist could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Their instinct was telling them something was wrong, something wasn't right about this encounter. It was more than just a casual conversation. They were being treated differently because of who they were, and it was becoming painfully obvious. They knew they had to protect themselves, to document what was happening before it went too far. That's when an idea struck them, a simple thought that could change everything. The protagonist pulled out their phone, keeping it hidden in their pocket but turning on the live stream feature. They didn't know if it would make a difference, but something told them they needed to capture everything. The officer didn't notice at first. The protagonist was good at keeping their movements subtle, but the live stream had already started. They could hear the soft, clicking sound of the phone turning on, but they kept their eyes locked on the officers, pretending as if nothing had changed. As the conversation dragged on, the tension grew. The officers weren't letting up. They kept pressing, their questions growing more and more aggressive. It was clear now that they were trying to provoke a reaction, trying to force the protagonist into saying something, anything, that they could use against them. But the protagonist wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. They remained calm, despite the insults, despite the racist remarks, despite the growing sense of fear that began to creep up their spine. They focused on the phone in their pocket, knowing that it was recording every word, every moment. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been in their shoes, who had ever faced this kind of injustice. The officers were relentless. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't figured out, was that they were no longer in control of the situation. The protagonist wasn't just another person on the street. They had something the officers didn't expect: proof. A simple live stream was about to expose the truth of what was happening, and there was nothing the officers could do about it. At that moment, the protagonist realized that the game had changed. They were no longer the victim in this encounter. They were the one holding the power. And as long as the live stream was running, nothing could be hidden anymore. The air felt tense. The officers' questions continued, each one more probing than the last. The protagonist had stayed calm, but now there was an unmistakable sense of pressure building. The situation had gone from what should have been a simple stop to something far more uncomfortable. The officers weren't acting like they were just doing their job. They were searching for something, trying to create a reason to escalate the encounter. "Where are you really from?" the first officer asked again, his tone more forceful now. "You don't belong here." "Why are you so far from home?" The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. It wasn't just a question anymore, it felt like an accusation. The protagonist's chest tightened as they thought about how to respond. They had heard these kinds of questions before, but this time, something felt different. There was a particular edge to the officer's voice, a way of looking at them that made it clear that no matter what they said, it wouldn't be enough. "I've lived here for years," the protagonist replied, trying to keep their voice steady, but the officer wasn't listening. "You don't look like you're from here. You sure you're not lying about that?" The officer pushed further. The frustration was starting to show. The protagonist wasn't lying. They were from here. This neighborhood was home, but it didn't seem to matter to these officers. They were determined to push further, to pry into the protagonist's life and force them to admit something they hadn't done. It was clear now that this wasn't just about questioning. They were trying to get the protagonist to say something, anything, that would give them a reason to make an arrest or take further action. The second officer spoke up, his voice sharp and demanding. "You fit the description of someone we've been looking for. Are you sure you're not hiding something?" The comment was a blatant attempt to intimidate. The description the officer mentioned was vague at best, and the protagonist knew it was just an excuse to escalate the situation. But there was no denying the pressure. The protagonist felt trapped, cornered by these questions that seemed to have no end. No matter what they said, it felt like the officers were already judging them, not for what they had done, but for who they were. The live stream in the protagonist's pocket continued to run, capturing every moment, every word. The protagonist knew that the camera might be their only ally in this moment. As the officers continued to press, they couldn't help but think about how much power technology had in this situation. The live stream wasn't just a way to document, it was a way to expose the truth. And in that moment, the protagonist was determined to make sure the world would see it. "Why are you asking me all of this?" the protagonist finally asked, trying to turn the tide. "What exactly do you think I've done?" The officers didn't answer immediately. Instead, they exchanged a quick, silent glance as if considering how to respond. Then the first officer turned back, his voice colder than before. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his words dripping with hostility. "But you'd better think carefully about how you answer." It was a subtle threat, but the protagonist didn't flinch. They knew their rights, and they knew that staying calm, staying quiet was the best move. They weren't going to give in to the pressure, not this time. The second officer moved closer, his stance aggressive. "You might want to start cooperating or this is going to get worse," he warned, his hand subtly moving toward his belt. The sight of his hand near his weapon sent a chill down the protagonist's spine. They knew that the officer was trying to intimidate them, but it worked. A flash of fear crossed their mind, and for a brief moment, they thought about backing down, about just walking away and avoiding any further confrontation. But then they remembered the live stream. They remembered the camera that was recording everything, the truth. If they left now, if they gave in to fear, then they would let the officers win. They would let them walk away without facing any consequences for their actions. And that wasn't something they were willing to do. Instead of retreating, the protagonist decided to stand their ground. "I'm not going to answer any more questions unless you tell me why I'm being stopped," they said, their voice steady but firm. "I want to know what you think I've done, and I want to know now." There was a brief silence as the officers exchanged another look, this one more uncertain. The tension in the air thickened as the protagonist's words seemed to make them pause. They were used to people complying, to people backing down in the face of authority. But this time, the protagonist wasn't backing down. The first officer took a step back, clearly thrown off by the response. He hadn't expected this kind of resistance, not from someone who looked like they could be easily intimidated. But the protagonist wasn't going to make it easy for him. They kept their posture strong, their eyes locked on the officers, refusing to show any sign of fear. "I'm not doing anything wrong," the protagonist said, their voice unwavering. "You can't just stop me like this. I want to know why you're questioning me, and if you don't have a reason, I'll be leaving now." The words hung in the air, charged with the kind of power that came from standing up for what was right. The officers didn't answer right away. Instead, they seemed to reconsider their approach, as if unsure how to handle someone who wasn't scared. For a moment, the protagonist thought the officers might just walk away. Maybe they would realize that they couldn't intimidate them, that they couldn't force them into a confession. But instead, the second officer's expression hardened, and he stepped forward again, his voice low and threatening. "We're not done here," he said, "and you'd better be careful how you play this." But the protagonist was ready. They knew that their words were being heard. They knew that the live stream was recording everything. And they knew that they had to keep pushing back, even if it meant facing more intimidation. Because this wasn't just about them anymore, it was about something bigger. It was about standing up against injustice. It was about showing the world what was happening in that moment, in that street, and letting people know that this kind of treatment couldn't be allowed to go on unnoticed. As the officers continued their questioning, the protagonist's mind raced. They knew they had to keep their composure. They had to stay calm, stay strong, but they also knew that the live stream had already started to work. The comments were rolling in and the viewers were beginning to speak out, offering support and demanding answers. The power of technology, of real-time documentation, was beginning to shift the balance of power in their favor. The protagonist realized something important in that moment. No matter what happened next, they were not alone. The world was watching. And that made all the difference. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control. The officers, frustrated by the protagonist's refusal to back down, began to grow more agitated. Their questioning became more forceful, more pointed, as if they were trying to break through the protagonist's calm exterior. It was clear now that they weren't interested in hearing the truth. They were searching for a reason, any reason, to escalate the situation. "You don't have to make this harder," the first officer said, his tone flat but filled with an underlying threat. "Just tell us what you're doing here and we can let you go." But the protagonist wasn't buying it. They had been through enough in their life to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate them, and this was exactly what was happening now. The officers didn't want answers. They wanted to trap them into saying something that could justify their actions. They wanted to create a narrative that would allow them to make an arrest or find a reason to take further action. The second officer stepped forward, now standing just a few feet away. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low and almost menacing. "You should have just cooperated. If you don't, things are going to get much worse for you." The words hit harder than expected. The protagonist's heart raced as they stood there trying to keep their cool. They had been in tough situations before, but this was different. The officers weren't just questioning them, they were threatening them. And the protagonist knew that if they didn't stand their ground now, if they didn't keep their composure, they could find themselves facing far more serious consequences. But the live stream was still running. The protagonist knew that they couldn't let these officers get away with this. The power of the camera was undeniable, and they felt a small but growing sense of strength knowing that every word, every action was being documented. People were watching. People were listening. "Why are you acting like this?" the protagonist asked, their voice firm but controlled. "What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment the officers didn't answer. They were used to people being intimidated, to people caving in under pressure. But the protagonist wasn't backing down. They had been calm, they had been respectful, but the officers kept pushing, kept trying to force an answer out of them that didn't exist. The first officer exchanged a quick look with his partner before speaking again. "You think you're smart, huh? You think this is a game?" He stepped closer, his body language threatening. "You're not getting out of this, not without consequences." The officer's words stung, but the protagonist refused to let it show. They stood tall, their posture strong, and they met the officer's eyes without flinching. "I haven't done anything wrong," the protagonist said, their voice unwavering. "You can't force me into anything." The second officer, frustrated, moved even closer. The distance between them was shrinking with each passing moment. He was now only a few inches away, towering over the protagonist. "We're trying to help you, but you're making this difficult. Just tell us where you're from and stop playing games." The pressure was mounting. The protagonist could feel their hands starting to sweat, but they kept their grip on the situation. They knew they couldn't let these officers control the narrative. The live stream, still running, was their only defense. They had to stay calm to hold on to their dignity and rights. "I'm not playing games," the protagonist said, their voice steady. "You've been questioning me for no reason, accusing me of something I didn't do. I'm not giving you anything because I've done nothing wrong." The officers looked at each other again. It was clear that their tactics weren't working. The protagonist wasn't reacting the way they expected. They had assumed that by using pressure, threats, and intimidation, they could break the protagonist. But instead, the protagonist had stood firm, unwavering. The first officer took a step back, his expression shifting from one of aggression to one of annoyance. He hadn't expected this kind of resistance. People usually caved under pressure, especially when they were alone, especially when they didn't have a way to fight back. But this time, the protagonist wasn't alone. The live stream was out there, and more people were tuning in, watching, and commenting. The officers couldn't hide their actions any longer. The second officer, realizing that they were losing control, tried a different tactic. He took a step back, crossing his arms, and looked at the protagonist with a more calculated gaze. "You know, you've been real difficult about this. Maybe you should just leave before this gets worse. We don't have to do this." The words were meant to sound like an offer, but the protagonist knew better. It wasn't an offer. It was a subtle threat, an attempt to make the protagonist feel like they were being given a way out, when in reality, they were being forced into a corner. The officer was trying to make them feel guilty for something they hadn't done, hoping that by doing so, they'd get the response they wanted. But the protagonist wasn't fooled. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what I've done wrong," the protagonist said, their voice calm but assertive. "I want to know why I'm being stopped." For a moment, the officers were silent. The silence between them was tense, thick with unspoken frustration. They weren't used to being challenged, not like this. It was always easier when people just accepted their authority, when they let themselves be pushed around. But this time, they weren't getting that. The protagonist wasn't backing down, and that was making them uncomfortable. Then, as if realizing that they weren't going to break the protagonist with threats, the first officer spoke again. His voice was lower this time, less forceful. "You're making a mistake," he said, shaking his head. "This is your last chance to make this easy." But the protagonist wasn't backing down. They took a deep breath, standing their ground. "I haven't made any mistake," the protagonist said. "You're the ones making a mistake. You're wasting my time." In that moment, the live stream viewers began to flood the comments, offering support, calling out the officers for their behavior, and expressing disbelief at what they were witnessing. The protagonist's phone buzzed with notifications as more and more people watched and shared the stream. The power of the moment was growing. The protagonist realized that the more the officers tried to intimidate them, the stronger they felt. They had something the officers didn't: proof, and that made all the difference. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, almost suffocating. The officers had pushed as hard as they could, using intimidation, threats, and manipulation. But the protagonist wasn't folding under the pressure. They had made it clear from the start. They weren't going to back down, not this time. And with the live stream running, they knew their every move was being watched. The power of technology, the truth, and the support from the viewers made all the difference. But the officers weren't ready to let go just yet. They had spent too much time on this encounter to back down now. It was clear they didn't want to let the protagonist go without a fight. The first officer, now visibly frustrated, stepped forward again, his expression darkening. "You're not going anywhere until we get answers," the officer growled, his voice dropping in pitch, becoming more menacing. The second officer, still standing close by, glanced at his partner before speaking up. "You're making a big mistake here. We could make things much harder for you if we want to." The words were calculated, designed to instill fear. But instead of feeling intimidated, the protagonist felt something else, a quiet strength building inside them. They had every right to stand their ground. They had done nothing wrong. The only thing that was happening here was an unjust confrontation, fueled by assumptions and bias, and they weren't going to let it slide. "Tell me what I'm being accused of," the protagonist said, their voice steady and clear. They weren't angry, but there was an undeniable edge to their tone. They were done with the back and forth, done with the empty threats. The officers exchanged another look, and the tension in the air seemed to rise even more. Neither of them seemed to know how to respond. Their initial aggression had been met with resistance, and now, instead of seeing a frightened person who would simply agree to whatever they said, they were facing someone who was calm, collected, and unwilling to be intimidated. It was a shift neither officer had anticipated. For a moment, there was only silence. The first officer's jaw tightened, his frustration mounting. He hadn't expected the protagonist to hold their ground for so long. He had assumed that with enough pressure, the protagonist would break, would confess to something they didn't do, or at least give them a reason to make an arrest. But now, it seemed like the protagonist was in control of the situation, and that reality was unsettling. The second officer, who had been standing to the side, finally spoke, his voice laced with irritation. "Look, we don't have time for this. If you don't start cooperating, we'll have to take you in. This will only get worse for you." But the protagonist, having already recognized the officer's intentions, wasn't swayed by the threat. They had been here before, dealing with situations that were unfair, unjust, and biased. They had faced moments where the world tried to force them to accept things that weren't true. But this time, they knew they had the power to fight back. They knew that truth was on their side. "You don't have anything to take me in for," the protagonist said, keeping their eyes locked on the officers. "You can't make me confess to something I didn't do." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The officers had been hoping for a reaction, hoping for fear, hoping to see their target break. But they didn't get that. Instead, the protagonist remained calm, unmoving. They weren't going to give the officers the satisfaction of showing even a hint of fear. And that in itself was a powerful statement. The live stream continued to capture every moment, and the comments were flooding in faster than ever. Viewers were reacting in real time, offering support, expressing their disbelief at what was unfolding before their eyes. Some viewers had already begun calling local authorities, reporting what was happening, demanding answers. The live stream was quickly becoming a beacon for truth, a direct challenge to the officers' actions. The officers, realizing that the situation was quickly spiraling out of their control, tried to regain the upper hand. The first officer, his frustration growing, stepped closer to the protagonist, trying to intimidate them with his presence. He loomed over them, his face inches away, eyes narrowing as if trying to intimidate the protagonist into submission. "You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be," the officer said through clenched teeth. "Just admit it. You know why we're here. Stop pretending." But the protagonist didn't flinch. They stood their ground, unblinking, unshaken. "I'm not pretending," they said. "You're trying to make something out of nothing." The second officer moved forward, now trying to appear more authoritative. "You're being difficult for no reason. Do you want to make this worse for yourself?" But again, the protagonist stood firm, their voice clear and unwavering. "No, you're the ones making this worse." The officers exchanged a look of frustration. It was clear that they didn't have a solid case, that they were grasping at straws, hoping that the protagonist would give them something they could use. But the protagonist refused to comply. They weren't going to give in to intimidation, to threats, to the officers' unjust behavior. In the midst of the confrontation, the protagonist felt something unexpected, a sense of empowerment. They realized that they weren't powerless in this situation. Yes, the officers had authority. Yes, they had power. But the protagonist had something they didn't, a voice, a camera, and a community of people watching, and that made all the difference. The first officer, now visibly annoyed, took a step back, his patience wearing thin. "You're making a huge mistake," he repeated, his voice barely controlled. But this time, there was a crack in his confidence. It wasn't the same intimidating tone from earlier. Now it sounded almost like a last-ditch effort to salvage the situation. But the protagonist wasn't listening to the threats anymore. They were focused on the reality in front of them, the truth. And the truth was that this encounter had nothing to do with their actions. It had everything to do with assumptions, biases, and an abuse of power. The comments on the live stream continued to pour in, people from all over expressing their disbelief, their anger, and their support. There were even viewers calling for legal action, asking what could be done to hold the officers accountable. The protagonist could see the impact they were having. They were no longer alone. The whole world was watching, and the officers knew it. Realizing that the power dynamic had shifted, the officers slowly started to back off, their postures softening slightly. They weren't sure what to do anymore. They couldn't intimidate the protagonist, and they couldn't find a reason to arrest them. The tension in the air was still thick, but it was now mixed with a growing sense of defeat. The protagonist, still holding their ground, knew they had won. Not because the officers had walked away, but because they had refused to let themselves be controlled by fear. They had refused to let the officers manipulate them into giving up their rights. They had stood up for themselves, and in doing so, they had turned the situation around. And through it all, the livestream had captured every second. Every word, every moment, every piece of the truth was now out there for the world to see. The moment the protagonist realized the officers were becoming frustrated, a small wave of calm confidence washed over them. They had prepared for this, though the situation was far more tense than they had imagined. Every word, every gesture of the officers now carried more weight than ever. The live stream, quietly running on their phone, was their shield, their silent witness and their strongest tool. While the officers leaned in with pointed questions, unaware that every move was being recorded, the protagonist kept their composure, controlling the pace of the conversation. The officers' voices grew louder, their tones sharper as they tried to force a reaction. They used every trick they thought might work, pauses that were meant to make the protagonist nervous, leading questions meant to trap them, and quick accusations that hoped to provoke an emotional response. But the protagonist stayed calm, their breathing steady, eyes alert. They spoke clearly and politely, careful not to give the officers a single misstep to twist against them. Each word was deliberate, each pause intentional, as if they were walking a tightrope over a dangerous pit. Yet the live stream was invisible to the officers, capturing every detail, every unfair comment, and every suspicious action. From their perspective, the world had narrowed to this one interaction. Every second stretched, each moment feeling like it carried infinite possibilities. They noticed the officers exchanging glances, small gestures of impatience creeping into their posture. It was subtle but unmistakable. The control they thought they had was slipping. The protagonist sensed this shift, feeling the tension turn into a kind of quiet advantage. They realized that the officers' attempts to manipulate the situation were no longer effective, that their own calmness and the unseen witness of the livestream were turning the tide. The protagonist decided to engage with the situation in a way that was both clever and safe. They answered questions honestly but with careful precision, never volunteering more than necessary. Each response was short but complete, polite but firm. When an officer leaned in, attempting to pressure them further, the protagonist subtly adjusted the phone in their pocket, ensuring that the camera captured every angle of the interaction. The officers continued, still unaware, thinking their tactics were working. Meanwhile, viewers on the live stream were already starting to notice the tension, sending messages of support and encouragement that the protagonist could read silently when a moment allowed. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The officers attempted to isolate the protagonist, suggesting they move to a different area, one that was more enclosed and away from public view. But the protagonist remained firm, politely refusing while offering a reasonable compromise that still kept them visible and safe. This was a turning point. The officers, now losing control of the narrative, began to show signs of irritation. Their questions became sharper, their tone edging into impatience, and yet the protagonist never broke eye contact or let their voice betray fear. The live stream continued to record everything, each moment more valuable than the last. At one point, an officer tried to make the situation more personal, asking questions meant to provoke emotion. They hoped to catch the protagonist off guard, hoping a slip of the tongue might lead to a false confession. But the protagonist was ready. They answered calmly, using simple, clear language, always returning the focus to facts rather than opinions or feelings. They spoke slowly, deliberately, making each word count. This careful strategy not only frustrated the officers, but also demonstrated the protagonist's composure and intelligence, qualities that viewers on the live stream were quickly recognizing and admiring. As the minutes passed, it became clear that the officers' confidence was faltering. They attempted to employ more complex questions, thinking that confusion might lead the protagonist to make a mistake. But the protagonist was meticulous. They repeated questions silently in their mind before answering, weighing each word. They maintained a calm posture, steady hands, and a neutral expression. Every small action contributed to a silent assertion of control, an unspoken message that they were aware, alert, and not intimidated. The live stream continued to broadcast in real time, documenting each interaction, turning a personal encounter into a moment of public accountability. The officers, now visibly frustrated, tried one last approach. They raised their voices slightly, hoping to provoke a reaction. They leaned closer, their gestures larger and more forceful. Yet the protagonist's calmness remained intact. They didn't flinch. Instead, they subtly shifted their phone, ensuring the camera angle captured every moment clearly, every unfair remark logged in the digital record. This simple but powerful action gave the protagonist a sense of control, even in a situation where they had initially felt powerless. The unseen audience, the witnesses of the live stream, had become an invisible shield that could not be ignored. As the encounter progressed, the officers' tactics became more transparent to the protagonist. It was no longer a guessing game. Their strategy was visible, their motives clear. This clarity allowed the protagonist to anticipate moves, answer questions before the officers could push too hard, and maintain composure even under intense scrutiny. The tension, once threatening, began to feel manageable. The live stream continued silently in the background, documenting each subtle victory, each display of composure, each moment the officers revealed their own biases and impatience. Small victories accumulated quietly. The officers' frustration grew with each polite but firm response from the protagonist. Each attempt to manipulate or trap the protagonist was documented, leaving a record that could not be disputed. Meanwhile, viewers on the live stream began to interact more, sending messages of support and sharing observations that helped the protagonist stay aware of public perception and maintain confidence. Though the protagonist could not read every comment at once, knowing the audience was there provided a subtle but powerful boost, a reminder that they were not alone. Eventually, the officers began to slow down, realizing that the situation was no longer under their control. They had underestimated the protagonist's awareness, intelligence, and preparedness. The live stream had become an unintentional witness, capturing behavior that could be used later for accountability. The protagonist, sensing the shift, maintained polite conversation, never allowing their emotions to show, never giving the officers a reason to escalate further. They used their words carefully, always factual, always calm, always deliberate. By the end of the encounter, it was evident that the power dynamics had changed. The officers, once confident in their ability to intimidate, were now visibly unsure. Their body language had shifted, their gestures smaller, their questions more tentative. The protagonist, who had once felt cornered and vulnerable, now walked away with a quiet sense of triumph. The live stream had not only provided safety, but had also served as a tool for accountability, showing that even in moments of pressure, careful strategy, calmness, and technology could turn the tables in a situation that initially seemed hopeless. When the protagonist finally left the scene, they felt a mix of relief and pride. The tension that had dominated the encounter was gone, replaced by a sense of empowerment. Every moment of composure, every careful word, and every subtle adjustment of the phone had contributed to a victory not just for themselves, but for the principle of fairness and truth. They knew that the live stream would serve as a record of justice, a testament to resilience in the face of intimidation, and a reminder that courage could be quietly powerful. When the protagonist finally stepped away from the scene, the tension that had gripped them for so long slowly began to ease. Their heartbeat, which had been racing like a drum in their chest, began to slow. They could finally breathe without thinking about every word or gesture. The live stream, which had been their invisible shield throughout the encounter, continued to record, quietly documenting the aftermath and the calm determination that now guided their steps. The streets around them felt ordinary again, but in reality, nothing would feel ordinary for a long time. What had just happened was extraordinary, a moment that would stay with them forever. Walking home, the protagonist reflected on the events of the day. They thought about how the officers had tried to trap them, how their words had been twisted, and how fear had tried to creep in. And yet, they had stayed calm. They had maintained control. Every decision they had made to livestream, to speak carefully, to remain polite, had mattered. They realized that courage was not about fighting with fists or shouting the loudest. It was about strategy, patience, and clarity. Even in the face of injustice, the protagonist had found a way to protect themselves while documenting the truth. Once home, the protagonist watched the livestream replay on their phone. Every moment of the encounter, from the initial stop to the final questions, was recorded. They could see the subtle signs of the officer's frustration, the hints of bias that had made the situation dangerous, and the ways they had managed to stay calm and firm. Watching it again, they felt a mix of emotions: relief that nothing worse had happened, pride in how they had handled themselves, and determination to ensure that this story could make a difference. The footage was more than just a memory. It was evidence, a record that could be shared to hold the officers accountable if necessary, and a reminder that they had acted wisely in a moment of high pressure. The protagonist shared the livestream selectively with close friends and family first. Their loved ones were shocked at the behavior of the officers, angered by the unfairness and bias, and proud of how the protagonist had handled the situation. Messages of support poured in, friends expressing relief that nothing worse had happened, family reminding them how brave they were, and even strangers offering encouragement after seeing clips online. For the protagonist, these reactions were comforting. They realized that their calmness, combined with modern technology, had turned a frightening experience into a story of resilience and awareness. Days passed, but the events did not fade from the protagonist's mind. They thought about the people who might face similar situations without the tools or knowledge to protect themselves. They felt a sense of responsibility, a desire to use their experience to help others. They began to think about practical steps, sharing safety tips, encouraging people to document encounters responsibly, and explaining how remaining calm under pressure could prevent dangerous situations from escalating. They also reflected on the emotional side, the importance of trusting one's instincts, maintaining self-respect, and using intelligence rather than fear to navigate difficult encounters. At the same time, the protagonist processed the emotional impact of the encounter. It had been exhausting, both mentally and physically. The officers' attempts to provoke, the sense of being trapped, and the undercurrent of bias had been overwhelming at times. Yet by staying composed and using the livestream strategically, they had preserved their dignity and safety. They realized that the experience had changed them. They had faced a test of character, and they had passed not by reacting with anger or fear, but by thinking clearly and acting strategically. It was a lesson in self-control, in awareness, and in the quiet power of courage. As they reflected, the protagonist also considered the wider implications. In a world where unfair treatment and bias could appear unexpectedly, technology could be an essential tool for accountability. The livestream had not only protected them in that moment, but could also serve as evidence to educate others and encourage fairness. They thought about how one small decision, to record, to stay calm, had transformed a dangerous encounter into an opportunity to make a statement about truth, dignity, and justice. The protagonist felt a sense of responsibility, to share their story, to inform others, and to remind people that even in challenging situations, careful action and awareness could make a difference. The protagonist began writing down the experience, carefully organizing the events so that others could understand the full scope of what had happened. They included details about how the officers tried to manipulate the situation, the ways they stayed calm, and how the livestream became a protective tool. They also reflected on the lessons learned, the value of preparation, the importance of maintaining composure, and the power of documentation. By putting the story into words, they could process their emotions, preserve the experience, and create a resource for anyone who might face similar challenges. Over time, the protagonist noticed how their story inspired others. Friends shared it with their networks, and strangers reached out to ask for advice on handling difficult encounters. People expressed gratitude for the guidance and inspiration, and the protagonist realized that what had been an intensely personal and frightening experience could now serve a wider purpose. The live stream, initially a secret shield, had become a symbol of empowerment, showing that careful planning, awareness, and technology could level the playing field in difficult situations. The protagonist also reflected on personal growth. They had learned that fear could be transformed into focus, that tension could become strategy, and that even in moments of uncertainty, individuals had the ability to protect themselves and stand their ground. They recognized that their calmness had not just prevented immediate danger, but had also created a ripple effect, influencing how they handled other challenges in daily life. Confidence and clarity, they realized, were as important as courage. Finally, the protagonist thought about the future. They knew that encounters like the one they had experienced could happen again, to themselves or others. But now, armed with experience, knowledge, and the power of documentation, they felt ready. They understood that fairness, dignity, and safety could be defended without aggression, and that their story could be a guide for others. They also realized that change was possible, not just for themselves, but for society, when courage and technology worked together to reveal truth and ensure accountability. In the quiet of their home, the protagonist took a deep breath and smiled, a mixture of relief and resolve settling over them. The encounter that had begun with fear and uncertainty had ended with clarity, empowerment, and a renewed sense of purpose. They had faced a challenge that could have shaken anyone, yet they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more aware. The story they had lived, captured on the live stream and preserved in memory, was no longer just theirs. It was a lesson, a warning, and an inspiration for anyone who might one day face a similar test. Through reflection, documentation, and sharing, the protagonist turned a moment of intimidation into a story of resilience. They had discovered that courage was not loud or aggressive, but thoughtful, deliberate, and strategic. Every step they had taken, every word spoken, and every second of the live stream had contributed to a greater truth, that even when faced with unfairness, individuals could protect themselves, stand strong, and make a difference. And in that realization, they found peace.